Welcome to Part 1 of the Hailrot Nmap tutorial. This tutorial covers basic scan types within Nmap and explains the different advantages and disadvantages with each. As with any pen test tool, use of Nmap should only be used against systems you have express permission to attack. So let's begin. First, a little background of what Nmap is and does. Nmap is an open source tool used to do network and system reconnaissance. Typically, Nmap is used during the discovery phase of a pen test and can provide the tester information about what systems are on the target network, along with operating system information, version numbers, and what services and applications are on those systems. Once the pen tester has this information, they can better decide on how to attack the systems of interest. Over the years, network administrators have learned that network scans are typically preludes to an attack. One technique to reduce the risk of attack is to hide targets from the attackers. This can be done through firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, turning off unnecessary services, or just moving services to non-standard ports. The idea is, if the hacker can't see it, they won't attack it. While it's true that a hacker won't attack something he can't see, the tools used by hackers have changed over time to counter these stealthy techniques. Nmap is no exception. Nmap has many different types of scan options, each one useful in different circumstances. For example, when used against stateful firewalls, or firewalls that look at the entire communication stream before releasing it to the intended server, Nmap can successfully scan systems using a SYN probe. However, if the target is using a stateless firewall, it's a good possibility SYN probes will be dropped and the scan will come back empty. To get around this, Nmap can send ACK probes instead, which typically find their way past stateless firewalls. However, even these probes may fail. Even so, pen testers can find these systems through other means like UDP, sending raw packets, and more. So let's take a closer look at how TCP communication occurs so we can better understand how the different Nmap scans work. In this slide, we can see how two different systems communicate using TCP. Here we see a diagram of the three-way handshake. These steps occur each and every time a TCP communication stream is created. We can see the client system starting the call by sending a SYN request. A SYN request has a couple purposes. It alerts the server and requests a reply, and it sets up sequence information so the two systems can later determine if packets get dropped and how fast the two systems can communicate with each other. So now that the server has gotten a SYN request, it sends back to the client its own SYN request, again with sequence information, plus it includes an ACK, or acknowledgement that it got the SYN request. At this point, the server has to wait for the client to reply. So now the client has gotten the SYN ACK back from the server. This tells the client the server got the original SYN and is ready to begin. However, the client now needs to tell the server that it got the SYN ACK, so it sends back an ACK and updates the sequence information. At this point, the client can begin sending data. That's the TCP three-way handshake. So what does this have to do with Nmap? Well, now that we understand how a TCP connection is made, let's look at some different probes you can use with Nmap. This slide contains the more basic TCP probes available in Nmap. The first one is the -ST option. This actually goes through the entire three-way handshake demonstrated on the previous slide. The advantage to this is that you absolutely know whether or not the service exists on the server because a complete communication handshake was completed. The disadvantage with the -ST option is it's very noisy on your network. Intrusion detection systems will definitely find you and figure out that you're trying to probe the server. Let's talk about the next option. The -SS option sends a SYN command to the server and waits for the SYN ACK to be returned. When the SYN ACK arrives, the client is supposed to send back an ACK and begin sending data. However, Nmap never sends the ACK. What this means is eventually the server will close down the connection and forget that it ever happened. This is a much more stealthy attack and is useful against stateful firewalls since they expect to see SYN traffic across their networks, thus not setting off any alarms. Now, stateful firewalls are more the exception than the rule. You'll find a lot more stateless firewalls out there which are used to filter out communication coming from unauthorized systems. In other words, it's much like a popular Hollywood nightclub. If you aren't on the list, you're not getting in. However, there are ways to get around this type of firewall. When stateless firewalls see an ACK come across the line for a particular port or service, it makes an assumption that a communication stream has already been established, and typically lets the ACK through. Because it's stateless, it has no idea if this is really true or not, it just assumes that it is. However, the actual server will know, since this is the first time it's ever heard of the client, and will send back an error message. Nmap takes this error message as an indication that the server is up and the service is available. Now, I took some liberties in explaining how stateful and stateless firewalls actually work and made some simplistic statements. To fully understand how firewalls work, there are many resources available on the net. However, these simplistic statements are sufficient for this tutorial. So let's move on. The -SF and -SX are different takes on the TCP ACK probe. Fin, urge, and push are different flags within the TCP communication protocol and are used to get around filters. Again, the idea is firewalls can't scan everything, so maybe one of these other flags will sneak through. The last probe, -SN, sends a TCP packet with no flags at all, in the hope that the server will get confused and respond similar to the ACK and FIN probes. A patient pen tester will try different probes just to make sure they aren't missing something. The more security conscious the network administrator is, the more probes the pen tester has to try just to get an accurate picture of the target network, which is a good thing. So let's take a look at some of the probes listed on this slide. Here we have the -ST probe. If you remember, with this probe you will only get those services that actually go through the complete three-way handshake. As we see, there are 3 services that are up. One other thing to notice in this probe is it only scanned 1,697 ports. 1,694 of those were filtered, 3 were open. So let's take a look at a more stealthy scan, the -SS probe. Again, we find 3 open ports, but this time, instead of seeing 1,694 filtered ports, we see 9 ports that weren't filtered. They were actually closed. A bit more information, but nothing earth-shattering. Here we did a -SA scan, which is an ACK probe. We get nothing back other than notification that all 1,697 ports are unfiltered. Interesting, but since we didn't even get the 3 open ports to respond, we can make a guess the server can't be tricked into responding to strange behavior. Let's see what happens when we try a FIN probe, or one with no flag at all. Here's our -SF probe, and again we don't even get the 3 open ports. So on to the next probe. This is the FIN with the urge and push flags. Again, no open ports. One last probe to try. -SN sends a packet with no TCP flag. Again, the server isn't fooled into giving up information when confusing data is sent to it. At this point, we could stop and try to focus our efforts against those 3 open ports. Rather than stop now, though, let's take a look at some additional and creative scan options available from Nmap. Sometimes you just want to know if a server is up. These probes allow you to determine exactly that using straightforward concepts. UDP is almost the opposite of TCP. With UDP, when you hit an open port, you get nothing in return. This is because the open port is expecting specific data and will only reply when this data is valid. However, if you hit a port that is not open, the server might tell you that you are making a mistake, that there's nothing there. So with a -SU probe, your best use of this option is to use it to discover systems rather than analyze what's on it. In addition, you can use this option to be very stealthy. Rather than scan all open UDP ports on a system, which is the default, you can tell it to hit only one port, which is usually a very high number that hopefully isn't being used. One UDP packet against a server will almost certainly go unnoticed, but 1,000 packets against a server might make enough noise to warrant attention from a network administrator. There are 3 different ICMP probes you can use to determine if a server is up. All 3 use the -SP flag, and each can be used to see if a server is up and responsive or not. The default option is to use a ping against the target server. A bit of caution is that many servers have intentionally disabled ping in order to hide from probes. Therefore, use of this flag may not give you complete results and should be verified using other probes. The last probe on this slide simply sends a raw IP packet to the server. This raw packet has no headers in it, meaning the server will have no idea what to do with it. Hopefully the server will respond with an error message, letting the pen tester know this server is alive and kicking. So now let's take a look at some of the results using these probes. Here we sent a UDP packet and got a reply. At least we know that this server is alive. In this example, we sent a ping to the server using -sp, and surprisingly it replied. Again, we now know it's alive. We then send the server a raw IP packet. The response is interesting and a bit more informative than the last two. Here we see that the server will respond to the following protocols: TCP, UDP, ICMP, and GRE. At this point, I want to pause. Up until now, there hasn't been anything of real interest to me in the previous probes. Sure, there was SSH, which means I might be able to brute force my way into a system, but that's almost always the last resort. The use of TCP, UDP, and ICMP are not unusual either. But the protocol GRE is used for VPN, and so far all our probes have turned up nothing regarding VPN. So at this point, I know something is hiding, and it's time to dig deeper. Nmap has some clever scanning options as well. -SI uses another machine, a zombie machine, to send off packets. This particular flag allows the pen tester to avoid suspicion and detection. This probe will not actually be demonstrated in this tutorial, but it is presented to make you aware of its existence. In the right circumstances, this probe is extremely powerful. The -SR RPC scan tries to find information about a server using the RPC protocol, which is a service that provides detailed information about available services on a system, including version numbers. This often is unreliable simply because RPC is often turned off in order to hide the server from malicious probes. The -SW probe uses TCP window size information to determine if a port is open or not. If a port is closed, the window is always 0. If a port is open, the window is something other than 0, even if the server tells you that there's nothing on that port. This is actually a very clever trick and often yields good results. The -SL probe doesn't actually send a probe. It uses DNS resolution to see if the target server exists. This probe is very unreliable and does not provide any information about services. However, it creates zero noise on the target network, which makes it useful in some cases. Lastly, the -SV probe provides detailed version information about services on ports. This probe is rarely used since the same functionality is provided with the -A flag. However, it is still available and is worthwhile enough to mention. So let's take a look at these probes. As mentioned, the -SL probe only checks to see if the target system actually exists in some DNS table. Notice it mentions the system was not scanned. The -SV probe gets detailed version information. Here we see OpenSSH version 4.3 is employed, and Apache version 2 is the web server for the system. Good to know if we need to look around for exploits. Here we see the -SW window timing scan. Again, this checks all the ports to see if the timing window increases. If it does, the port is open. What we get back is a huge amount of information. You'll notice there is a lot more information from this probe than from previous probes. When we get to the bottom of the list, we can see that PC Anywhere is listed, which is probably the reason for the GRE protocol being used on this server. So now we have a much better understanding of what is on this server, and hopefully enough information to find an exploitable vulnerability. But we'll save that for a different tutorial. We now conclude this tutorial of the Nmap scanner. Additional tutorials within this series can be found at heorot.net. If you have any questions about this tutorial or the information security services provided by Heorot, please don't hesitate to contact us. Contact information can be found at heorot.net. I hope this tutorial has been helpful in understanding the different scan types available in Nmap, and thanks for watching.